I believe that as economic geologists, we've made a very, very important discovery in the last 20 or 30 years. And it's not one of those discoveries where someone just all of a sudden discovers the DNA and publishes that. It's a sort of discovery that's kind of emerged organically from quite a few different studies. But this is this idea, and it gets a little bit back to what I said about, four-dimensional parameter space and ore formation. It's this increasing realization that we have these long periods of geological activity, whether they be orogenesis, basin formation, convergent margin processes, and yet ore formation occurs in very, very narrow time intervals within these long periods, but often over large areas and often involving multiple types of deposits. And I'm just going to give you one example because I think it really exemplifies it well, and that's the famous Kuroko VMS deposits of Japan. They're some of the first VMS deposits to ever be documented. They're not in the Western literature.
On this episode of Measured, I'm really excited to be checking in with my friend Jon Hronsky. I met Jon around 2009 at a conference field trip, and I remember thinking, boy, does this guy know a bit about mineral deposits and exploration. Now, years later, I reconnected with Jon through the Australian Geoscience Council, which got us talking about geoscience education and geotourism. And we delve into that subject a little bit later in the conversation. Jon has worked for Western Mining Corporation for 23 years, ending up as its global geoscience lead. Now he operates through his own consultancy, Western Mining Consultants, through which he runs his acclaimed Senior Exploration Management course. In this conversation, we cover quite a bit of ground, from the mineral systems approach to finding new deposits, making discoveries undercover, what makes companies successful at exploration and finding new deposits, Western Mining Corporation's study leave scheme as a way to train and upskill geologists, the difference between working as a consultant or in a big company. And of course, we cover the flavor of the decade, machine learning. And we talk about how exploration targeting really works, how Jon has proven that his approach has success, the role of what Jon calls fundamental architecture in mineral deposit formation. I ask him why he believes his senior exploration geologist course is such a success, and that also leads us into a brief discussion on geoscience education and Jon's passion, geotourism. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Let's get into it. Hey Jon, good to see you.
Yeah, hey René, good to see you too.
Yeah, we've been speaking actually for a few times in the last few weeks on a number of topics that we both care about, but this was a great time to actually connect and maybe lift some of those topics out a bit further, because we were sort of bantering over the email, what do you want to talk about? And as I sort of say to many people, it doesn't really matter. It's a conversation, and I like to talk to people who've got interesting careers and have got interesting things to say. And your career, I mean, when we first met, I believe it was a field trip actually in the North Island, and correct me if I'm wrong.
I remember it well, yeah.
Right, yeah.
2009, I think, yeah.
Yeah, it would be thereabouts, and I was still fairly green, and I was on this field trip, which was led by somebody else, but there was this guy on the trip who knew something about everything, and I was like, I think he knows what he's talking about. So yeah, I remember that very well, but. Maybe before we dive too much into history books, looking at your particular background, interesting trajectory of getting to where you are now. Do you want to take us through a bit of that? I mean,
sure.
I mean, maybe even starting. I was talking to somebody before about structural geology and his passion for structural geology. When did that start for you, or just geology in general? I mean, was that something, or were you one of these people just rolled in, I'll see what I figure out when I do a few subjects, or did you always want to become a geo?
Sort of neither of those, but I have to say, first of all, I grew up in Kalgoorlie, which is obviously a well-known mining town, and my father had worked as a geologist. He never actually had formal qualifications. He had a correspondence degree, but that got him a job during the nickel boom. So I remember going to my first exploration project when I was about 6 or 7 years old, and I actually do remember that. So I had that sort of exposure, but when it came to the end of high school, you look around for things to do, and doing geology at the WA School of Mines seemed like a good thing to do. I can't say I had a sort of massive passion for it, but I discovered about a year into it that this was really what I wanted to do, and I graduated. I was lucky enough to join Western Mining Corporation.
Yep.
It's a company that no longer exists. It was bought by BHP in 2005, but under the leadership of the late Roy Woodall, there were a couple of things that were quite special about it. One was a very strong focus on looking at the big picture, large structures, the role of the mantle, the role of continental scale features in mineral deposits. And look, that's sort of been and the importance of using those to target. And that's been a theme that I've certainly tried to develop and be an advocate for over my time. And I think it's basically accepted now, sort of 40 or so years later, but it wasn't at that time. So Roy and the people working with him, I think, were quite visionary. But
what do you mean not accepted? So the principle of this sort of big picture targeting from a big crustal
very much so.
perspective?
A lot of people would cast a lot of doubt on that, particularly what I call the North American or the American Cordillera School of Geology, which really dominated economic geology in the second half of the 20th century. It was very much about doing a detailed study on the deposit and working out the various alteration facies around a porphyry deposit.
Right.
All good stuff, but the guys that were focused on that really didn't look at the big picture and kind of almost ideologically didn't really think it was relevant. And some of that in Australia, we've always had more of a culture, and to a certain extent in Southern Africa as well. And I think some of that is that for a long time in Australia, we've been making discoveries undercover. I mean, Olympic Dam was 1975, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do that, you really do have to think more about the bigger picture. Well, the term we use, which I quite like these days, is the mineral system approach, which is thinking about all the aspects of it. And Western Mining was certainly a pioneer of that. The mineral system approach. In fact, it was a mineral systems analysis that led to the Yeelirrie uranium discovery in the early 1970s. That was classic. Yeah. So there was that approach that was sort of unique about Western Mining at the time. But the other aspect that was unique was an extremely strong focus on developing and educating the staff. So Western Mining had this thing called the study leave scheme and really valued that. So geologists, after they'd worked for a few years and I suppose to a certain extent proven themselves, were given the opportunity. And I guess initially it was typically a sort of a 1-year master's to go and study in Canada or something like that. But I was actually fortunate enough to get support through an entire PhD. And there were many people who benefited from that through the Western Mining era, and many of them went on to become very senior and very successful members of the industry. And I kind of find it interesting that today we have companies who have market caps probably 10, 20 times what Western Mining ever had at its peak, and yet don't do this type of investment because it's that whole truism, people your greatest asset, but this was an example of really putting really putting some resources around that. So
did it have to do with the leadership? I mean, was it just because the people on the boardroom knew that this was important? It was their own philosophy rather than, I mean, we can talk about the accountants and the lawyers that make our boards and as geologists and be all high and mighty about it. But is that because those people had that philosophy and built that into their strategy of success, or?
Look, absolutely, there was a cultural issue. Now, I have to say, in Western Mining, it was really only the geoscientists that this applied to. There wasn't the same sort of culture for the mining and the processing guys. Now, a lot of people credit, the late Roy Woodall for this, and certainly he was a really strong advocate of it. But what I like to point out that in 1953, when Roy Woodall had been working for Western Mining for maybe a year or two, he was given the opportunity to go and do a master's at Berkeley. So think about this. This is a small West Australian mining company, had a little bit of cash flow for some gold mines around Norseman, but very, very little at that point. This is before the big discoveries of Kambalda and so on. And yet this company saw fit to send someone who had worked for them for a couple of years to Berkeley, right? And Roy studied with the late Charles Meyer, was a grade of economic geology, and I don't know whether people know that much these days about Charles Meyer. I was lucky to meet him once as a young guy before he passed in the early 80s. But he was the guy that first pointed out that mineral deposits through time changed, and they changed in a way that reflected the evolution of the Earth system. So at one point you had uraninite and dotrytal pyrite deposits in the Witwatersrand. That told you something fundamental about the atmosphere. And then you saw red beds, which told you had the great oxidation event. He pointed that out. And, I think a lot of people forget that this whole narrative in, I guess I want to say planetary geology now, that NASA and people like that spend a lot of time on, how planets evolve, that was first recognised in the domain of economic geology through people like Charles Meyer. Anyway, yeah, right. Roy was very lucky to have his masters with Charles, and I think that was a profound influence. But my point is the company was already doing that before then, and that was going back to people like Lindsay Clark and W.S. Robinson. W.S. Robinson was the financier that founded Western Mining and a number of other companies in the 30s, and it's worth sort of commenting that Western Mining was a company that was specifically founded in 1933 because there was a surge in the gold price related to the Great Depression at that time, so that changed the economics, the perception of gold mining. But it was specifically founded to apply the latest advances in science in mineral exploration to exploration in Western Australia. So they brought guys like McKinstry, who was a famous researcher at Harvard. They brought him over, and their big technical innovation was that they got these two aircraft to carry out a airborne photogeological map of the Yilgarn of the eastern goldfields to try and find new gold deposits. Now, that wasn't actually successful, but that was the first systematic effort to actually use remote sensing, I suppose, for want of a better word, in mineral exploration. And to my knowledge, probably the first in the world to do that. So that was a sort of culture. So I've got a little bit off on a tangent there, but I guess what I'm trying to say is there was a culture in Western mining that I was very, very lucky to be part of for 23 years. I mean, I started as a junior mine geologist and I finished in the most senior technical geoscience role in the company, effectively the chief geoscientist. And look, there were many other opportunities to go and do other things in that time, but it was a culture that kept you there because of that focus on innovation. And maybe the third aspect of it was that, and I thought this was just part of the furniture of Western mining, but we were encouraged to participate in research groups and things like that, and to contribute externally to various sort of organisations that support our industry. And it was only I discovered after, Western mining came to an end and I was now working for another company that wasn't necessarily the culture of all these big mining organisations.
So what's the that's really interesting to hear. I mean, I obviously knew a bit about the background of the company, and things have changed because 23 years is not the average tenure of the average geologist at any company. So clearly it got something right, and you hear that from everybody who used to work there, right? And so that leads to a whole bunch of follow-up questions, and maybe going from the last one backwards. What's the current best equivalent for a culture like that you know of in the industry? What companies are out there that are either trying to get there or are close enough of getting there? Because look, René, it's not just innovation, but
yeah, sure. And look, that's a tough question to ask, and I work in the industry, and I'd prefer not to provide a detailed analysis of my peers.
Yeah. But only positive things, obviously, right? This is a positive, positively flavored question. But I could also ask, what's the worst company you know of?
No, it's not. It's not. Look. I think some companies are really making a big effort in this space, and if I call them out, I don't want people to think that by exception that I'm criticising anyone.
For sure. Right? Yeah. No, that's fair enough. Yeah.
But I do think the IGO group in particular have really bought this culture. I think that's a group that I think goes some way to do that. I think for the First Quantum group, also are doing a pretty good job. I'm really seeing some very positive things in BHP these days. can't probably honestly say that's always been the case, but I really like some of the things that are happening there.
Yeah.
I think Rio Tinto have always been fairly strong in this space. Perhaps not as widely engaged with the broader community as they could be, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are a few organisations doing this. I know there are some companies who have got, I think, Barrick has sent a few people on study leave that I'm exposed to. So there are bits and
Good things
pieces
happening there.
Yeah, look, what I would probably say, somewhat in defence of the modern company, is we're in a world where people are way more mobile, have more opportunities. So you touched on it before. The idea of a sort of a corporate loyalty, if you like, was a much more prevalent thing in the sort of mid to late 20th century than it is today. So that's also going to influence these things. But nonetheless, I think that if you're a big mining company, exploration is inevitably going to be part of your sustainability strategy, and developing people and developing an interest in science, innovation, curiosity, all those things that Western Mining and Roy Woodall were a champion for, are really going to be at the core of that sort of DNA.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's really interesting to hear you explain all of that, because, I run a small company and obviously we want to create the culture that, everybody else aspires to, right? And everybody needs to be the most hungry geologist that goes to bed on a Friday night with 4 papers and extracurricular study and all the rest of it. But yeah, that's just not realistic. And like you said, the industry has changed, society has changed. The grass is very green now because you got access to so much information about other companies, other opportunities, other places to live. It's easier to be connected and to just jump on a plane and work from somewhere else or remotely, and everything in between. So that probably makes it harder for people to chase that culture now, because sending somebody on a 1 year and pay for them, you can only really do that with some big budgets and some long-term thinking. So I can see that. I mean, plenty of young companies.
I will make the point, Rene, that most of the companies I'm talking about are much larger than Western Mining ever was.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, that's a fair point. That's. But with your I guess your consulting hat on now, with that experience and that really broad knowledge, having seen a few things, wouldn't that be the perfect advisory role for companies like that, for yourself to sort of, not particularly from a geological perspective, but from a strategy and a cultural perspective, right? Because that's where a lot of the gains can come from. Do you do any of that work, or how do you provide that?
Look, I do quite a lot of work on mineral exploration strategy and how groups function, which relates to this. I mean, I'd probably say in my consultancy business, I've really got 2 main sort of streams, and one is, if you like, exploration management, which I also teach with my colleagues in Denver. We teach this course, senior exploration. Yeah, but and certainly I look at groups and I work with groups to improve it. And then the other theme is actually very technical around targeting at multiple scales. But getting back to the exploration management side of things, as far as culture and all those things go, yeah, from time to time, I certainly get approached by people just to have a coffee and talk about how these schemes work, and there's a level of interest in doing that and sort of trying to emulate aspects of that system. And I guess there's probably some of that's happened, but I do find it interesting that I might get an approach, have a conversation with a representative of a large company, and maybe 3 or 4 years later, I'm talking to someone else who's asking me the same question. Yeah. Not that much has changed.
And that maybe leads to another question, because have you been tempted to go back to the dark side and work in the corporate, or space? Or are you quite happy to do what you do?
Honestly, Rene, absolutely not. No. Look, I spent 23 years in large organisations, and in fact, I was never someone who ever thought of myself as someone who would be self-employed and would run my own business. But when I was leaving BHP and I was contemplating my future, I guess it's sort of, and sometimes when you have those moments of introspection, they're actually a little bit of a gift to be given them. And
Yeah.
I thought, you know what I don't want anymore, I don't want any bosses and I don't want any employees. I'm sort of over that. I'm happy with clients. I'm happy with partners,
Yeah.
even shareholders, I suppose.
Yeah.
But uh, I don't want to work in a hierarchical organisation. And I mean, lots of people do. Lots of people do good work in that situation. But I'd done it for almost a quarter of a century, and I thought, you know what, I think I'll do something different for the next phase of my career. So,
Well, fair enough. And you're obviously talking to a converted. I mean, I don't think I'll ever go back. I mean, I wouldn't last a day in the army, as I always joke, and I lasted a few years in a company. But it's nicer. I mean, it's the versatility of the work, right, and the various problems you come across, and you just really are. You're constantly in a new environment.
Look, absolutely, Rene. That resonates with me. Your previous statement. So one of the thoughts, a number of thoughts about the contrast between the two modes of working, I suppose. But one of the things that I often thought about was, as a geologist, you're interested in lots of different things. You see lots of opportunities. You have lots of ideas. If you're working in a company, even a really big company, I found that there was probably about 5% of that was actually aligned with the strategy of the company, and the rest of it doesn't go anywhere. Whereas if you're consulting across, a wide range of commodities, okay, you've got an idea about gold. Gold companies are interested, but base metal companies are not. So if you just work for a diversified major, no one wants to know about your gold idea, right?
Yeah.
Or no one wants to know about your uranium idea. But if you're consulting, you can do stuff with all those ideas. And of course, the power is that, and I'm really passionate about that, when it comes to the science, when it comes to our science, real understanding comes from synthesis and holistic perspectives, not from reductionist perspectives. It's how it all relates together. And I firmly believe there are only everything that we see and deal with in terms of the science of economic geology is a very small number of underlying processes, interacting in sometimes complex ways with complex manifestations. But you've got to view these things as holistic systems and what are the most important drivers. So I think, and you only get that perspective. You don't get that perspective from studying one deposit in a lot of detail.
Exactly.
You get that perspective from studying a lot of deposits, but also a lot of scales of observation as well. Like, from continental scale, I do a lot of continental scale work through to deposit scale work and how all these things interact.
Well, it's a great point, and I discussed this the other day with Brett Davis. I don't know if you know Brett.
I do, yes.
And really trying to hone in on the the puzzle solving and how many puzzles you need to have seen to be able to recognize patterns with limited data. And that's just the typical profession where good structural geologists are as rare as hen's teeth or whatever they say somewhere. And it's true, because you rarely find people who have seen so many deposits where subtly, I mean, you would never do this through quote unquote machine learning because there's so much variability in it. You would never get there. And that's maybe for later, but
well, Rene, I'm going to have to comment on that because you said something that really resonates with me. Yeah. You've really articulated it very well, and that is, in my opinion, the essence of what we do in mineral exploration, probably all geology, but mineral exploration, geology in particular, is exactly what you articulated, which is, we look at fragments of data, always grossly insufficient data to come to any high confidence conclusion about things. But we take those fragments of data, those very poor fragments of data, and we apply a mental model which has been developed through experience to make decisions which reduce the probability or increase the probability of finding something and reduce the risk of our investment. That is, don't let anyone tell you any different. That is the essence of what we do in mineral exploration. Yeah. And, I understand that machine learning is very much a flavour of the month, or flavour of the year or whatever, in terms of mineral exploration. Lots of people saying, well, if we get all this data, we're going to apply it. I very, very firmly believe that mineral exploration is not a big data environment amenable to machine learning because, we actually have very little data relative to the parameter space that we're trying to make decisions about. Unlike other applications of machine learning, where I guess it works very well, where the data that's available to the algorithm is a pretty good representation of the parameter space that you're trying to make decisions in. Exploration isn't like it. It's fundamentally an extrapolative process where that extrapolation requires some sort of experience-based mental model. Anyway, that's my
well, look, it's good to hit a sensitive point, because obviously this is not the flavor of the month or the year, but of the decade. And full disclosure, I mean, there is a lot of activity happening, whether it's software products being developed or whether it's targeting. And I'll kind of come back to targeting, because you mentioned that as one of the tools in the toolkit. And I do feel there is a space for that in areas that are heavily reliant on big data, and where you have it, and where your models aren't just, as you call it, mental models, right? Because, and the way I was discussing it with Mike Stewart the other day, I'm not sure if you're across his background, but as a resource geologist, but with a very steady, heavy structural and mapping geology background, right? So not just a programmer, really investigating whether, from a resource geology perspective, at any point a computer is going to give us some ideas about the domains that we need to build to constrain our resources. And it's really difficult to do so, I guess, intuitively, because these deposits are subtly all different, and you need so many more training data to actually have a sensible signal being fed to be trained for the machine to be trained on, right? You need good training data, otherwise machine learning doesn't work. Talking to Jackie Coombs as well on this subject, and she had a banger one-liner, as she tends to have, that machine learning is, what did she say? Regression on steroids, I think was the phrase that she used.
I think that's, look, honestly, I don't think that's too harsh. I mean, I think machine learning, or the current sort of iteration that's referred to as machine learning, is fundamentally just multivariate statistics, but very, very powerful ones. And I think in the right application, it can do a lot. But even in the context of resource modelling, the problem is to get the level of data that you probably require to have confidence in that sort of approach. You probably have to overdrill your deposit, right?
Yeah.
So it's a trade-off. Like, can you reasonably connect these few drill holes and say that's a geological contact, and I can infer that because as a human I can make that connection because I sort of understand how it works. Or do I have to drill another 10 holes so that the computer is going to say, oh yeah, that's a geological contact?
So how about targeting them? Because, I got into the industry working for a small consulting group in New Zealand who at that time focused on prospectivity modeling and its classic permutation and, fuzzy logic models and weights of evidence. And it was, but at that point, we didn't have the machine learned algorithms, and it was all two-dimensional and so on. And, what it did, it allowed you to quantify the various data layers that your brain wouldn't be able to interpret all at the same time to come up with some sort of sensible quantification of prospectivity. It didn't necessarily mean that that's where you will find it. It gave you a bit of a push in the back, as I like to call it. And obviously, you have to market it a lot stronger than that. Otherwise, you can't get out of the product what you want, and you can't have the dialogue. So I think, for that reason, it's easy to misrepresent that. Now, obviously, that's been overtaken by the various groups who have replaced the engine room of that now with these algorithms that we just spoke about. And look, the results are quite often quite powerful from a targeting perspective, because you are essentially working with a bunch of layers. Obviously, you do have to have that user input, right? That where the specialist looks at it and makes sense of the data, both of the actual input data and any results that come out. So whether you just let the machine do its thing, or you have some sort of handle on the steps that are involved, and the results are really quite powerful in places. So when you talk about targeting, whether it's back in the days with Western Mining or the work that you do now from a big system approach, are you coming from a real sort of principled approach to this targeting study, or are you relying on any computerized model approaches for that sort of work that you do?
So
it's a bit to unpack there, but yeah,
there's quite a lot to unpack there, and I'm not. I was thinking as I was going along, but I'm not sure I'm going to keep all the points in my head for this conversation. To tackle the last thing first. No, I don't use any formal quantitative computer analysis in my targeting. My belief is that, and I'll talk about sort of some technical reasons why I think this, but I think targeting is usually about defining 3 or 4 critical parameters, never really more than 5, that are relevant to your metallogenic model, and then making some sort of interpretation of the spatial distribution of those parameters in a search space, a volume or an area where you have actually very, very little data, right? I think that's in my view, the essence of targeting. So, one of the concepts that I think is really, really important in mineral exploration is the idea of the exploration search space. I think that's the key concept that relates anything we might do technically to commercial outcomes of the business. And it basically says a very, very simple thing, and that is, if you're going to look for an economic deposit, there's going to be a certain parameter space, both physical but also dependent on the quality of the deposit you're looking for example, also commercial, where you can actually look and expect an economically effective outcome of that process. And virtually by definition, that parameter space will be poorly populated with existing data, because if it's got a certain amount of data, the ore body's already found or it's already been sterilised, particularly if you're looking for something significant. When it comes to prospectivity mapping, and I did publish a paper with Oliver Kreutzer a few years ago, I think it was 2020, which was a bit of a critique of prospectivity mapping. I don't intrinsically have a problem with the methodology, but I have a problem with how it's most usually applied. And what this relates to is, in my opinion, in many studies, a sort of naive relationship of the input data to the outputs. And I just want to talk about one specific issue that's very, very seldom addressed, and that is, if you think of the typical data that's put into a prospectivity analysis, you might have data sets such as regional magnetics, regional gravity, and so on, and then you'll have other data sets which are like outcrop geological mapping, geochem sampling, drilling. And there's a first order distinction between these two types of data that is seldom made, and that is the distinction between objective data and bias data, or objective evenly sampled data and bias data. So here's my area that I'm interested in. If I've covered that whole area with a systematic magnetic survey or gravity survey or whatever, to a first order, I've objectively sampled that data set for that area. So there's no real bias to one part of the area versus the other. But if then I layer on a mineral occurrence map, automatically biased. If I layer on an outcrop geology map, automatically biased, right? So if I then treat those layers the same, I'm going to bias my data set. And in my opinion, having seen lots of these studies, one of the common critiques of prospectivity mapping is it biases the prospective areas to the areas with greater known data density, and that's going to be an inevitable byproduct. I mean, pretty much all surface geochemical sampling is in that category of subjectively biased data, with some maybe rare exceptions such as till sampling in Scandinavia and places like that, because you've got really one sampling medium which is sort of 95% of the exposure and it's been well sampled. So it kind of almost approaches the sort of objectivity of a geophysical data set. But generally that's not the case. So if you don't allow for that, you're always going to get a biased result. So my sort of philosophy of targeting is a two-step. I call it a Boolean Bayesian approach. A Boolean in the sense that what I like to do is start off with a number of elements that I can actually identify in an objective way. And this requires a degree of interpretation. Don't get that wrong, but an objective way from an unbiased data set. So, for example, I might have a magnetic gravity, whatever data set, and I'll interpret, I think this is the key structures, a couple of key structures. Here's a key lithological unit. I can do that, and I can do a simple Boolean, A plus B, if then whatever, and come up with some targets. Right? Now, when I generate those set of targets, some of them, so I've done all this with unbiased data. Now, some of those targets there'll be nothing else to add because they're undercover, right? They may still be very good targets. They might host a world-class ore body. Another target, the same sort of target, might have a little bit of outcrop in it, and that outcrop might have a high-grade rock chip in it. So from a Bayesian perspective, which says, you start with your prior and then you upgrade your value of the probability, the target that's got a little bit of a sniff gets upgraded through that Bayesian perspective. So yes, if it's the same in terms of the first order targeting criteria I've applied, I will prefer that one, but I certainly won't reject the other target. So I feel philosophically that's a really important distinction to understand the difference between your biased and your objectively sampled data sets. Sure. And then to understand that you need a two-layer approach with an interpretation. I mean, it has to be an interpretation because you can't just work from the raw objective data. And so you still need your geological model and your metallogenic model. And that, of course, will be informed by whatever you understand of the metallogeny of that deposit type or that area. Mm-hmm. But you apply that model at a relatively simple case level, because this is what you usually find. You usually find it's not, with the level of resolution of the data we typically have available to us in a regional context, it usually is a small number of these parameters that converge. Often only 3, sometimes only 2 parameters that will converge to define your targets. But then you can apply your Bayesian approach. Now, if you don't actually have any additional data to apply in that Bayesian layer, that's telling you something fundamental, and that is you have to go out and collect your own primary data, right? So, one of the things I teach in our course about mineral exploration are basic principles. The first step, make sure what you're looking for actually makes a difference to your organisation. Secondly, generate a valid search space where that deposit might exist, i.e. where it hasn't already been found, and it could be. Thirdly, go out there and proactively collect your own primary sampling data in that search space. And then fourthly, make sure you feed all the results back into an iteration on your model and on your results and sort of drive that learning loop.
Yeah, that's fantastic because, and as you sort of list them all up, if you take a step back and look at it, sounds pretty logical, right? I mean, it's intuitively a logical approach to targeting. And I think, exploration doesn't have to be, it's making sensible decisions to go from large to small. And you can throw endless mathematics at it, but it's this system understanding. And look, from what I do know about it, and I'm certainly not the authority. And again, as a side note, I have a conversation lined up with a machine learning prospectivity modeling group. So I would love to throw some of this stuff their way and see how they chew on that. And maybe at some point we'll have a 3 or 4-way discussion. That would be really interesting because I probably don't have the depth of knowledge to ask the right questions. But it sounds fairly intuitive that a few layers make all the difference, and a few sensible steps in order of priority to get 9 out of 10 times the right approach. So but at the end, the proof will be in the pudding, right? I mean, and that may be a question with a few decades of experience. You either have found deposits at the end of the day, or you haven't, right? And through implementing this process, can you maybe take us through a bit of a example of where this has worked or where?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously you can go back to the Western mining days and the Olympic Dam discovery. Some of my personal experience, the discovery of the West Musgrave province, and then working with guys like the Gold Road guys for Gruyere, where you going out into an area that sort of had the parameters that you were looking for. No fancy machine learning there. I guess more recently, a product of a continental scale targeting study I did is now advanced in joint venture with a major gold company to the point where we found a kilometre long outcropping gold vein with up to 3 grams at the surface. And people say you can't do that anymore in Australia. Well, that's not true. Yeah, we've done that, and we'll be drilling it shortly. So I feel like, Karlawinda Bore, that was another conceptual target. We drilled the first hole. We drilled free gold. So I think it works, and it works because the fundamental reason that targeting works is that there is only one way. I mean, all deposits really are a function of focused mass flux through the crust, right? So it doesn't really matter what you're looking at. The first order physics of ore formation is that you need to have organised, very concentrated vector fluid flow, regardless of the processes of where that fluid comes from or how the metals are stripped out of that fluid. I like to say many different chemistries, but only one physics. And there is a set of architecture that is commonly continually reactivated. So, people talk about, isn't it a coincidence that at Mount Isa we've got a giant copper deposit overprinting a giant zinc deposit? Isn't it a coincidence that at Kambalda we've got a giant gold deposit overprinting a giant nickel deposit? Actually, it's not coincidence at all. You can go to the Carlin Trend and see that on the same mining lease that's got one of the big, Eocene, I guess, Carlin deposits, on the same mining lease as a Jurassic Porphyry and a Devonian Mississippi Valley type deposit. And this is the rule rather than the exception. And the reason is it's the fundamental architecture that gets reactivated over time. And this also relates to, I think, what is probably the biggest discovery that's been made in fundamental geology this century by people like Graham Begg from Mineral Targeting International and the team at Macquarie Uni, and that is that 80-90% of the continental lithospheric mantle and probably most of the lower crust actually formed by about the Mesoarchean, and just subsequently had a history of reactivation and reprocessing, right? Mm-hmm. And in other words, pretty much the oldest deposits that we're interested in are about 2.7, 2.8 billion years old. Now, the Earth had almost been going for 2 billion years up to that time, and it turns out that pretty much the architecture was already frozen in. So, and particularly when we're looking at really young deposits in the like in the Phanerozoic, it's all reactivating young architecture. I mean, even today we're finding evidence of Archean lithosphere under the South Island of New Zealand, for example. I mean, that's a big thing that's emerging now. So this architectural control is important. And getting back to what I said before about a limited number of key factors. Now, I can look at a sort of a regional magnetic image or a gravity image and say, look, I've got these linears and I'm interpreting these as translithospheric structures. Now, some of them will be, some of them won't. If I had a map, if I had a map where I could definitely say which ones were translithospheric and which ones weren't, I reckon you'd very rapidly find most of the big deposits. The problem is at the moment I have to use various lines of inference to decide that. There is progress, and I'm not sure whether you're aware of the recent initiative to commit to the WA array in Western Australia, but we're committing now to a 40-kilometre grid of passive seismic stations. We will have the best characterised lithosphere in the world, right?
Yeah.
So this is like the James Webb telescope for the Earth, yes. And that will be a fundamental critical data. It will take us a few years to get there, but that's the sort of geoscience infrastructure that will help us, go to the next level and understand these fundamental structures. There is a pattern about targeting, and there is a pattern about ore deposit formation, and I might continue to rant on this for a little bit because
go for it.
Because one of the things that one of the perspectives that I sometimes get a bit irritated with is what I call the white flag approach to sort of economic geology, and what I mean by that is, some famous person will be asked, some famous academic economic geologist, and I've seen this happen a few times. A journal says to them, write a paper about what controls giant ore deposits, right? And what you end up getting with a paper, they say, well, what a giant ore deposit really is the fortuitous combination in space of all these positive factors. In other words, I mean, and it's not actually untrue that things have to come together to make an ore deposit, but it's a fundamental philosophical perspective. Are you saying it's just a random combination, or are you saying there's some structure to it? Now, I think you can refute this sort of stochastic random model very easily by saying, well, then ore deposits should show a distribution in space and time that's effectively random, right? A Poisson distribution. They don't. They show very strong fractal clustering, which implies a structure. So my perspective is somewhat different. I say that ore formation is the inevitable product of certain parts of the four-dimensional parameter space of the evolution of host basins and origins. In other words, take the example of a convergent margin subduction zone. It can do different things. It can retreat, it can advance, it can be associated with crustal thickening. Within that overall parameter space of possibility, there's a window in there. When it's in that window, it's forming deposits, right? Now, of course, you still have to preserve them and all of those sort of things, but it's not like all of a sudden something random happened. There's a lot of situations where you'll never form a deposit because it's not consistent with what you need. And one of the things you need is you need to organise this mass flux system, right? So the way I think about targeting is you've got your architecture, and I've discussed that at some length, that provides the first order permeability control of the lithosphere. You have to have that. But that's a bit like the roadmap. The roadmap doesn't necessarily tell you where the traffic jams are, right? Where the traffic is. So what's using that roadmap? Well, what you have to do is identify at a particular time, that's why the four dimensions are important, which parts of that architecture were actually being activated. And that really relates to geodynamics. So it's the superposition of metallurgically relevant geodynamic anomalies on that architecture, which is actually the key. So what that means in a practical sense is, you've got your various geological layers. The critical thing is to time slice it, and time slice it as well as you can to the mineralization event, and then superimpose the heterogeneity in that geological time slice on that structural architecture. And that's kind of how I think about targeting.
Well, and that you don't just put into a box and press a button and have a couple of numbers coming out. I mean, the way you describe it, and it's interesting because I can listen, at length to the prospectivity modelers pitching, the philosophy about that, and go into endless detail about the philosophies and the strategies that lie behind it as well, and go, that's really fascinating, and it really. Almost, I'm just sitting here thinking there must be because there is a utility to that in certain situations, but so fundamentally and so clearly explained as it's never been coming into my ears like that, and it's the classic plea for. Going back to basics to understand mineral systems, right? It's a mineral systems approach, as you called it. And look, I know from a lot of these groups that they actually, they don't employ data scientists, they employ geologists who have those skills to obviously put that angle on it. But, there is so much more to learn to really fully comprehend it at that fourth dimensional scale that really fascinating. And maybe just tie that in with, you talked about the course. So is this the stuff that you go through during the course, or is that more the hands-on management stuff?
A little bit of that. Look, our course is about exploration management. It's not about mineral targeting. No. We do a mineral targeting course, or have done it for clients when requested. Okay. I mean, that's a 4-day course of its own.
Sorry, just give us a bit more information if people are interested in that. Is that delivered on site, or is it remote? Or
Yeah. So let me just give a quick background on our senior exploration management course. So this is a product that myself and my colleagues based in Denver, Colorado, Western Mining Services also developed. We first delivered it in 2009, and in the pre-COVID world, what we typically did is we did it once a year in Perth and once a year in Denver, Colorado. And in the Denver, we kind of really target most of the Western Hemisphere. Of course, COVID hit, right? So what that motivated us to do is to generate a virtual version of the course. And we've done that, and we've got a number of people participating in that at the moment. But I'm excited to say that we're actually doing now, for the first time in 3 years, in October in Perth, we'll be doing an in-person course again. So, which obviously we enjoy more than the virtual course, but, of course, COVID's COVID sort of thing. and so we're hoping that we'll be returning to that. Now, that course is called Senior Exploration Management, and it really came out of the fact that, we'd all worked as senior people in the mineral exploration industry, and we realised that there was a massive knowledge gap, at least in what had actually been written down or published or was available in terms of how you actually did mineral exploration management. So if you go back to the turn of the century and you kind of looked around for some information about how to be a mineral explorer. You would have had a fair bit of stuff about deposit models, and then you would have a bit of stuff about, how to organise drilling programs and drill rigs and stuff like that. Maybe a little bit about, how to apply for tenements. But what you never had was anything about how you took those exploration technologies, how you combined them with fundamental geoscientific understanding, and then delivered to the commercial objectives of your organisation to implement a coherent exploration strategy that was actually going to make an economic difference to your investor, whether it's the shareholder of a big company or a junior miner. That was a massive gap. And we kind of realised that there was a set of concepts that if you sat down with and talked to someone who'd been doing this successfully for 20 or 30 years, that they kind of knew intuitively, but in a lot of cases probably couldn't even really articulate. So that's the difference between tacit and explicit knowledge. So our mission in this course was actually to take this tacit understanding that I think good explorers had and crystallise it as explicit knowledge that we could then communicate through our course. And, we probably made some contributions to that, but a lot of it was just crystallised. And I think that's one of the reasons it resonated with people, because experienced people would listen to us say, oh, yeah, that's what I always thought, but not necessarily being able to articulate to anyone else.
Yeah.
Because what we wanted to move away from, Rene, was a world where, a junior geologist starts in mineral exploration and takes 25 years to gain the sort of intuition to be effective. Can we actually short-circuit it? Can we give them concepts so after 5 or 10 years they've got that level of understanding? And, I've sometimes made the sort of analogy that, the way we train mineral explorers has been a little bit like if you related it to how you train doctors, right, it would be a little bit like saying, well, okay, you go and do a human biology or anatomy degree, right? You get that degree, then you go to that hospital there and, you follow that guy around and, try not to kill too many people. We don't train doctors like that, right? We realise that there's a whole body of knowledge associated with being a medical practitioner that builds on the body of knowledge about fundamental human biological processes. So mineral exploration is no different. Sure, there's a whole body of knowledge about geoscientific processes, but then there's a whole additional body of knowledge that relates to mineral exploration that has to build on that if you're going to deliver an outcome that's actually meaningful.
Yeah, I looked at the course that it's the level that it's pitched at, though. So it's exploration management. So you're obviously you're not pitching at entry level there, right?
We're not. No.
Yeah.
And a lot of people do good stuff at entry level, right? Mm-hmm. And you and I have obviously talked about this in a different context. But I'm a believer that what we need to do as an industry is to develop this sort of lifelong learning agenda with various components over the career. And there needs to be some, structure and organisation about that. We're just one component of it. I mean, we're not interested in, and other people do good work on that. I know the DigiRock people, Peter and John Libby, are in that space, and other groups are. And before our course, there were other courses that were. Andy White had a course, the late Andy, on. Exploration management, but from my perspective, a lot of those were out the transactional aspects of that. Like how do you do a contract, how do you peg a lease, those sort of things. So that's all important stuff too. But I guess in terms of a syllabus that might be part of a sort of a lifelong learning agenda, where the next step, where okay, those things, but how do you harness all of that? How do you link it together in a way that's actually effective in finding ore deposits? So getting back to the other part of your question about targeting. Yes, we address targeting, but only in so much as to make sure that potential exploration managers understand some of these aspects about targeting. We're not trying to make them into targeting specialists in our course, but we do think that targeting is such an essential part of the business of mineral exploration, you have to have an understanding of it.
But just for clarity, if people are interested in just that targeting part, because I'm just thinking top of my head here. I mean, I would have an interest in hearing more about that in a really focused way, and perhaps some folks in my company would be particularly. Keen on
we've run a
something
number,
like that.
usually in-house courses. Usually a
Customized,
big company says,
yeah,
can you come and talk to us for a few days about targeting? And
yeah,
we don't do it as a specific public domain product.
sure.
And some of that is because exploration training is not really our day job. I mean, we do it. We do the senior exploration management course because we're passionate about the industry and trying to change the industry, make the industry better. But in our day job, we're actually also busy out there trying to find ore bodies as well. So,
well, it's funny that you say that, because I was talking to Brett Davis about exactly this thing. He likes to teach what he knows to people, and so do I. And we're not doing it to pay the bills. I mean, it makes a bit of revenue, but it certainly doesn't create a business. So it's really because of the passion. And I talked to Richard Lilly not too long ago as well, which is a talk that probably has aired by the time this comes out, but also very passionate, coming out of the industry, going back into education, really just across that bridge. And coming back to something you said a bit earlier, there are definitely a whole bunch of little islands of excellent education, and they all cover a fairly narrow band, something specialized, and it'd be great at some point to unify that into something more. I mean, obviously the institutes, and again, this comes back to what you mentioned before, that we're both tinkering with either through the AGC or general interest, is, that whole university, I think demise is probably too strong a word, but the fact that education at that level is definitely moving away from the standard university space, and what is then going to fill it? Is it the institutes? Is it consultants doing their thing? Is it a program like Nexus that Richard is running? What is it? And I'm sure, I mean, this is an open-ended question, because I don't think either of us have the answers, but at least everybody plays their little part in it, because I've had a number of people on the podcast talking about education. I mean, Jackie Coombs, also very passionate about this, has been running her courses across the world for years. And like you said, on top of a normal work week of actually consulting and doing all these other things. So it really is interesting to see where those solutions will come from. But
yeah. So Rene, if I can just share a perspective, my perspective on that, there's a couple of aspects. One is, I think the universities should focus on training people in geoscience, the science, and not really so much on how the exploration industry works, for the simple reason that when tertiary institutions tend to do it, they tend to get ossified quite quickly, because things can move quite quickly in terms of your various technologies and so on. So I think the focus should be on the science. That's the first point.
For sure.
I think that there should be some broad concept of what the lifelong learning syllabus, and sorry, I'm going to be biased to mineral exploration. That's my passion. What that syllabus should look like. And I think that maybe it's beholden on certain groups, whether it's the AusIMM, whether the AIG, to be in broad terms the custodian for what that syllabus should look like, and maybe to a certain extent say, yes, that's an endorsed course, or that is, or that isn't. But I think there should be freedom for the market for people to operate in that space, and those courses to be related to this syllabus. But I also think that we continue to have issues with intake into geology. I mean, it is driven by the mining cycle, but it also competes poorly with things. For example, marine biology. The analogy that someone gave me the other day was, there's roughly the same amount of geophysicists paying tax in Australia as there are marine biologists. It's about 1,200, so not a big number in either case. And there's one university or something that's teaching geophysics, and there's 35 that are teaching marine biology. And and that's because our university model is driven by student preference rather than strategic need. And I think there's a discussion to be had there with the political masters, but I think we probably also have to acknowledge that if you want the next generation of geophysicists, you're probably going to have to convert them from people who've gone and done astrophysics and found that not everyone can be Matt Agnew and or Alan Duffy, and they've got to do something else, and so then they might come and be geophysicists in the mineral exploration industry. Even with geoscientists, there's obviously many people that will go into sort of allied things like maybe environmental science and so on, probably massive oversupply. But, if you could do a 1 year conversion course to give them some of the geoscientific understanding or transition into what they can do to become geoscientists that are more aligned with the mining industry. Yeah. And then the last part, strategic part that I see of that is I do think as a community, and now I'm talking about the broader geoscience community, not just the mineral exploration or the mining industry, I think we have to work a lot harder to promote geoscience in the popular culture through the broader community. And I'm not sure whether you're aware, but one of the things that I've been closely involved in for the last few years has been the AGC's geotourism strategy. And you go, well, why is someone who's basically a mineral explorer interested in geotourism, which is a very, very different field? I'm interested in it because I think this is one of the big opportunities we have as a community to reach out to the public and the broader community. Because, there's a lot of exciting things about, when people go to the Kimberley, they go to the outback. If they can be exposed to geology there, geology is starting to enter the consciousness in the same way that, marine biology does, because they watch, David Attenborough or something on TV. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he talks about fossils as well. He knows more about fossils than I do, that man. It's so we should.
He's pretty good on fossils, but there is more to geology than dinosaurs, as they say.
Well, that's how most people roll into this. I mean, I had my fossil collection, and that got me hooked from an early age, going all the way back to the start of our conversation, and linking it to where we are now. Yeah, at age 8, I knew I wanted to be a geologist. It was dead set, and that's and practicing in New Zealand as well, which was on the.
Well, New Zealand is such a great laboratory for geoscience. I tell you,
No, it's happening right here, right? Yeah. Look, I mean, some might argue in Holland it's also happening, but at a different level. But if you like,
hopefully not at below sea level.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, if I tell people that I was born 13 meters below sea level, people find that hard to believe. But no, it's a fair point, and I don't know whether we will solve all those issues, but it's that philosophy. I subscribe to that. It is that outreach, and I mean, I talked to Hayden Mort about this a few weeks ago as well on the podcast. It's about putting our profession in a positive spotlight and having that news flow come out. But at the end of the day, we need to make it exciting for people, and we're competing, right? We're constantly competing with other interests, and
we are. But I think there are a lot of things about geoscience that are pretty exciting, actually. But
we're biased. To go back to our previous targeting exercise. Now, look, I mean, great discussion, and I think maybe we'll pick up that second conversation at some point with a round table, because I watched the ASAMM. What's the word I'm looking for? The chat that you led on geoscience education. The work. That's right. That was a really interesting chat for people interested in that. I think it's freely available on the internet. I'm not 100% sure, but I'll put a link in.
I'm pretty sure it is.
Yeah, and maybe I'll put a link into the geotourism as well. For sure. Hey, look, anything that you wanted to raise that is on your mind, or?
Look, I just wanted to circle back to something that in terms of general geoscience that I just feel has not got the profile that I think it should have had, particularly in our academic community. And that is, I believe that as economic geologists, we've made a very, very important discovery in the last 20 or 30 years. And it's not one of those discoveries where someone just all of a sudden discovers the DNA and publishes that. It's a sort of discovery that's kind of emerged organically from quite a few different studies. But this is this idea, and it gets a little bit back to what I said about four-dimensional parameter space and ore formation. It's this increasing realization that we have these long periods of geological activity, whether they be orogenesis, basin formation, convergent margin processes, and yet ore formation occurs in very, very narrow time intervals within these long periods, but often over large areas and often involving multiple types of deposits. And I'm just going to give you one example because I think it really exemplifies it well, and that's the famous Kuroko VMS deposits of Japan. They're some of the first VMS deposits to ever be documented. They're not in the Western literature. And, we all know the story about VMS deposits. They occur along rift zones, et cetera, et cetera. But when you actually look at the Kuroko deposits, and they're not very old, they're Neogene deposits, you see that, yes, you've got this back arc rift forms, and there's millions of years of back arc rift. Then there's an abrupt period, there's an abrupt transition at 14 million years ago where the volcanism changes, you shift from back arc rift to some sort of alkalic magmatism and so on. But all the deposits occur right at that transition. You've got a prehistory of rift formation, nothing's happening. Then you have a transition, and all the deposits form. Closer to home, but further back in time, we can talk about the VMS deposits of northwestern Tasmania and the Mount Read volcanics, and they talk about the holy host, right? The one horizon, the time horizon that hosts all the deposits. And I could go on and on with examples. The 440 MA event in the Tasmanides that hosts the giant Cadia deposits, but simultaneously giant orogenic deposits at Bendigo and Stawell. So we're talking over 1,000 kilometres within the origin, right? And tens, if not hundreds of millions of years either side of those events where nothing's happening. So, and we see this across a whole range of commodities. And so it tells us that whatever this process is, it's not idiosyncratic to a particular mineral system, but it must be more fundamental than that. It must be something to do with the fundamental physics of how these things organise, right? And it's saying that there are certain geodynamic states that are fundamentally favourable for the organisation of fluid flow and the concentration of fluid flow. And despite the fact this idea and the data to support this idea have now been out for probably the best part of a decade at least, I find it very interesting that none of all the smart scientists that we have in academia are actually tackling something at this scale. Instead, they're still tackling orogenic gold deposits, porphyry deposits, nickel deposits. And to me, if we're going to advance as a science in the 21st century, we've got to get away from this sort of reductionist perspective, and we've got to start to organise our research effort around some of these really, really fundamental themes, such as this organisation and ore formation in very narrow periods of time. So that's probably my last rant there, Rene. But
no, that's a rant that I had not at all crossed my thinking line here. So that's I'm gonna look into this further, because I occupy myself way too much with sampling and resource block models these days, and it's nice to actually talk some geology again. Where can people who are interested in this find, if there is some links we can share, some papers, or do you have something that I can link to maybe in the description once this goes out?
Oh, look, there's probably a few things on our website where we've talked about this. I think that the paper that Cam McQuaig and myself wrote in 2014 discusses this topic quite a bit.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the best published reference.
Yeah.
But what I'd like to see, I'd like to see more. I'd like to see more academics working on this.
Yeah. So where's that go bust then? What is that just a philosophy that is just deeply entrenched in the academic framework that everybody follows the set pathway?
I think so. So maybe I will add one. That question has triggered one more comment from me, René, and that is that, and this may be true of all science, but one of the things I notice about the research infrastructure, say relating to economic geology in this country, but probably globally, is that you've got a funding opportunity around going deeper and deeper and more expertise in your domain, and that's the stuff that's competitive for AGC. So you become better and better at a particular aspect of science, and then you've got funding through things like the CRC system, which are all about a particular commercialization product, right? But the one thing that we don't have any really available mechanism to fund is synthesis and integration, how you put all that together.
Yeah.
And the academic reward system gives you absolutely no benefit or reward for synthesis. So if you're a big researcher in economic geology and you write a textbook which brings it all together, right, that will be a net negative for your career. Because you write this textbook, it might be a really great contribution to the whole community, but that'll be at the expense of writing the next 4 or 5 papers in Nature or whatever that you're going to get rewarded for, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a structural problem in how we fund research. As I said, I don't know whether it applies to other sciences or not, but I see that as a problem. So I think this lack of emphasis on synthesis, this bias against it, more than lack of emphasis on it, this bias against it prevents us from making these really critical key connections, which actually, of course, are across the silos in terms of scientific domains, but they also need to link in the various technologies and the applied parts as well.
Yeah, I know, that's really interesting, and that actually makes me think back to a comment that Jackie made about research in Australia, and I probably get the numbers right, but apparently there's only 10% of the budget that we used to spend 20 or 30 years ago into research, in whether it's mining or exploration or geoscience related. I can't remember, but just in general, the pool of money going into research and development is so much less than it used to be. And on top of that, if you add a few silos and some really short sort of tunnel vision thinking about this, you're not going to tackle the big problems. So that's clearly an area to improve in, but that's not solved in a couple of days either. So. That involves the politicians and that's obviously some of the discussions with AGC that you've been probably focusing on for a number of years.
Let me just take up that point as well. Not solved in nothing really important is ever solved in a couple of days. But one of the things I've learned over several decades is if you have a strong vision of how things should be and you work away at it, you can actually get a lot done. And I've seen others do that as well. Yeah. So, that's why I'm much more interested in, first of all, staking out where we want to go at the level of a manifesto. And that was Uncover, for example, and what we're trying to do in the AGC at the moment. So articulate the playing field, articulate the vision, try and enroll as many people as you can into that vision. Don't necessarily try and prescribe aspects of the solution because that'll be organic, but make sure that we continually all working away aligned with that broad umbrella vision. I mean, I think that's the approach.
Well, look, that's fantastic. And nothing works without that volunteer effort, that passion of a select few people who drive these things. So, thanks for what you do and what others there do as well. And so that's really, really interesting. Look, fantastic discussion. Thanks so much for making the time, John. It's been good to catch up.
Pleasure, Rene. Good to chat.
Yeah, good to chat, and hope to catch you in Perth at some point for a beer.
Sure.
Fantastic.
Make sure you look me up when you're here. Okay.
Will do, man. Catch you later.
All the best.
See ya.
Cheers.